Hello everybody and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to look at voting behaviour in the UK. Now this is a really interesting topic, one I get particularly excited about because there's lots of statistics in it which I particularly enjoy, and it's a really interesting way of thinking about politics and what is it that affects the way that people vote, the way that people see politics, and the reasons why we end up with the governments that we do. Let's start with the spec and what it tells you need to know. Well, this is 4.1 on the specification for Unit 1, Component 1, and it tells us that we need to look at case studies of three key general elections. So one from 45 to 92, the 97 election, and one since 97. I'm actually going to look at 4 in this video because I'm going to look at both 2017 and 2019. And we look at the results and their impact on parties and government. The factors that explain the outcomes in these elections, including the reasons for the impact of party policies, manifestos, techniques used, wider political context, class-based voting, other factors on voting patterns, such as partisanship and voting attachment, gender, age, ethnicity, and regional factors influencing voter behaviour, turnout, and trends. Right, and we're going to do some analysis of some national voting behaviour patterns for these elections. And why they vary. Now, I'm going to start off by looking at some of the key elements. Actually, I'm going to start off by looking at some of the reasons why people vote in different ways and explaining some of those before looking actually at some of these elections in more detail. Of course, obviously, given the focus on the case studies that's in the spec, on top of what I'm going to talk you through in the video, I would suggest that you pick your 3 and you do further research to make sure you've got absolutely everything you could possibly need. So there's a whole range of things that are involved in voting behaviour, and there's lots of factors and theories that we need to take into account. Some of it is fairly straightforward. So it can be things like regional preferences. So wherever you live, you might think in your area there is a strong preference towards a political party, or you might live somewhere where there isn't. So, for example, in South Yorkshire, where I live, there traditionally is a strong preference towards the Labour Party. There are some constituencies which are different to that, but overwhelmingly that has been the case. Now, that has seen a degree of shift in 2019, so that will be something we talk about with that election. Traditionally, voting was linked in with class. So if we think of the emergence of the Labour Party again, they emerged as a working class party. But voting has never been quite that straightforward because obviously we've seen large periods of Conservative dominance, which you wouldn't see if all the working class voted Labour. So class has traditionally been assigned, not completely, but has been seen as fitting in line with how you vote, where you expect the upper and middle classes to vote Conservatives and you expect the working classes to vote Labour. And there is an idea that there has been a break in this, what is called as Class D alignment, where class doesn't so much play a key role in deciding how people vote. And again, we'll see some statistics on that. There are some quite interesting studies on gender, and so, for example, traditionally it was believed that women were more likely to vote Conservative, and then there's some data more recently that shows that is less the case. Age is one that is particularly significant in recent elections, where actually you can argue it is pretty much the best indicator of how people will vote. And therefore, obviously, the differences in voter turnout in the different ages is really significant. And essentially, the younger you are as a voter, the more likely you are to vote Labour. The older you are, the more likely you are to vote Conservatives. The problem for the Labour Party in that is the older you are, the more likely you are to actually vote. The younger you are, the less likely you are to vote. And so this voting behaviour can have a really significant impact on election results. Ethnicity is another issue where we can see degrees of alignment. So, for example, the white vote predominantly in most elections is Conservative, whilst the black and other ethnic minority groups tend to vote more, and in some elections overwhelmingly, for Labour. The level of education is something that has really focused the minds of people looking at voting behaviour in recent elections, whether there seems to be a strong connection between education and how you vote, and it appears that the higher level of education that you have, the more likely you are to vote for either the Labour Party or the Liberal Party, and the lower level of education that you finished with, the more likely you are to vote Conservative. Now there are some theories really looking at voting behaviour. One is rational choice that we'll look at, and this suggests that people look at what is the best, what's in their best interest, and who they should vote for will bring the best results for them, and they make that decision. And the fact that everybody does that then means that you end up with a winner who is overwhelmingly the rational choice of the society. You get issue voting, where actually it's the major issues of the day that swing elections, and there'll be particular issues that people will place as being the most important, and then they will look to the party that is closest to them on that issue. There's Valence issues, and this is essentially where actually you expect all parties to basically say the same thing. So like, we're going to make the NHS really good, we're going to make the economy really effective, and we're going to make it grow. And so they're not really kind of going, oh no, we don't think that a good education is a good idea, a good education system is a good idea, or a good NHS is a good idea, or a good economy is a good idea. They're all saying we're going to do good things for this, but it's which party you trust to do the best on that, and that's where you get Valence issues. And increasingly, particularly with the media spotlight, party leaders are overwhelmingly important when it comes to elections. And so people are often thinking not really about who would be their best MP, but who it is they want to be leading the country. And so we end up almost with a kind of American presidential style election, rather than one that actually meets what was actually going on in reality with our constituents. So, are regional preferences, class and gender accurate predictions of voting behaviour? Well, there are some bits which is really quite solid with regional. So rural England and the home counties vote Conservative, and you could pick any election really from 1945 onwards, or even before, and you would find the rural vote would be overwhelmingly Conservative. The home counties in the south east would be overwhelmingly Conservative. London and the industrial north tend to be overwhelmingly Labour. There is a shift in 2019 where bits of what is known as the Red Wall, which is a kind of a strip going over from Liverpool through Manchester, across Sheffield, Leeds, and over to Hull and up to Newcastle. This kind of band, which is traditionally all Labour. There is a bit of a shift in that. There has definitely been a shift in Scotland, which was always very much traditionally a Labour heartland, and is now dominated over recent elections by the SNP. Wales, which again was always a traditional Labour heartland, is largely remained in Labour. They haven't lost Wales in the same way that they've lost Scotland. In terms of class, well, we've got in modern class, we've got these different categories. People talk about A's are higher managerial and high level professional, B middle class, middle managers, C1s are kind of office workers, clerks, secretaries, things like that. C2, which is skilled manual labourers, builders, plumbers, electricians. D, which is semi-skilled or unskilled workers. E, who are the unemployed and pensioners. Now, traditionally, Bs and C1s vote Conservative, and C2s, Ds and Es vote Labour. But this has changed, and increasingly, and we'll look at this in a bit more detail later on, with this idea of class de-alignment, where actually it doesn't marry up, and you'll get people from these different groups voting in large numbers the way that you wouldn't expect them to. Now, traditionally, as I've mentioned already, female vote tend to favour the Conservatives over the Labour, and the other way around for men. The change is now shifted to a degree, and is possibly marginal, and possibly, for example, in the female vote, gone the other way. And there has been a much greater attempt in recent elections to target female votes, including things like Labour have done since '97 with the all-women shortlists. So class de-alignment and partisan de-alignment. So these are two key shifts in how voting was looked at. So it was believed, when we had really a very, very solid two-party system, that essentially you had the working classes voting Labour and the upper middle classes voting Conservatives. And these groups provided the core vote. So it was not 100% of all working class voted Labour, not 100% of all upper and middle classes voted Conservatives, but largely in these social groups you got the core voters of the major parties. It isn't demonstrated absolutely because of Conservative dominance in the post-war period, but normally people will go, if you played the odds, you go, you're from this social group, we think you are more likely to vote this way. And that was particularly true up until 1979. And in the 80s, we start to see a move away from this with conservative moves such as the selling council houses, the right to buy. We also see it continue actually with Blair's government and Blair's ability to attract the middle class vote. So we see both the Conservatives and the Labour Party, when they're at their most successful, stepping outside that core vote and attracting voters in from the class groups that you wouldn't normally associate with them. And class de-alignment as a theory suggests that the idea of class being a dominant factor in voting behaviour in the UK that is just over. It's just not important anymore. I mean, there is an increasing number of what is known as either floating or swing voters, and this is demonstrated by the fall of the Red Wall, and this kind of, again, things that people looking at this indeed are very excited about, where you've got people who have never ever voted Conservative ever before, who've done it for the first time. You've got constituencies that have been Labour for 80 or more years that are suddenly Conservatives. And this also suggests there's something called partisan de-alignment. This suggests that people are willing to shift who they vote for. So in a way, this almost suggests that politics has become a little bit less tribal. And now, in a way, we could say that is true, but in the other case, it might be actually what we've seen an emergence of, particularly since 2016, is the emergence of two new tribes, which are Leave and Leave and Remain, and actually that's the tribal division, and what's been confusing is a kind of not quite aligning with the party system at the same time. And we've also seen a fluctuation in votes for major and minor parties. So, for example, in 2017, we seem to have this return to the dominance of the two major parties, whilst in other elections, we've seen not only groups like the Liberals do quite well, but we've seen UKIP attracting huge numbers of votes. And in particular, we've seen that shift in Scotland with the growth of the SNP. So age, ethnicity, education, are they accurate predictors of voting behaviour? Well, they can be, actually. Age seems to be one of the ones with the strongest connections, and this predominantly means essentially if you're under 40, there's a very good chance that you'll vote Labour. If you're over 40, then there's a very, very good chance that you will vote Conservative. The bad news for Labour on this, as already mentioned, is that younger voters are less likely to vote. And so if I look at some of the statistics here for 2017, 18 and 19-year-olds, well, 66% of them voted Labour, 19% of them Conservatives, but the turnout was only 56%. And those who were 70 plus, 69% of those voted Conservatives and only 19% Labour, and the turnout was 84%. So again, a very, very strong kind of correlation between that, and this kind of predictor of voting behaviour is really taking over from some of the old ones like partisan models and class alignment. Ethnicity seems to play a role. I mean, the numbers here aren't quite so stark, but we have got a lot more white voters voting Conservative than we have voting Labour in 2015. So 39% to 28%. UKIP picked up a reasonable chunk of the white vote in that election as well. Black and ethnic minority groups tend to favour the Labour Party. So we've seen 2015. We've got a 65% vote for Labour, 23% vote for the Conservatives. And again, generally speaking, the white vote is generally higher, has a higher voter turnout than the BME vote. So we've got in 2015 68% turnout compared to 56%. And again, we're seeing across these areas that we've just looked at, we're seeing a thing where actually the voter turnout is really, really significant, because we've got groups that favour the Conservative Party who are voting in higher numbers than in groups that favour the Labour Party, but they're voting in lower numbers. I think probably one of the ones that is most surprising, and therefore probably one of the most interesting, is the stuff to do with education. And this seems to really go back on earlier ideas in terms of class, potentially, because what we see is actually the Conservatives doing really much better with groups with less formal qualifications than Labour and the Liberals do. So there's a graph up above me. If you look at that, those with out formal qualifications, 53% vote Conservative, only 5% Liberal, and 18% Labour. We also see UKIP in that election doing particularly well with that group. Then if we get all the way up to people with degrees, then we've got 36% voting Conservative, but 19% Liberal and 28% Labour. Now, this could be connected to a number of issues. So this might be connected to issues such as Brexit. It might also potentially be connected to some of the other statistics we've looked at. And if you look at, for example, the percentage of people going to university, this has risen dramatically over recent decades. And therefore, we probably have got more people in the younger age brackets who have got higher levels of qualification. And again, if we look at our statistics on age, then the younger generations are more likely to vote Labour. So it might actually reflect the age thing. It might be a sign of complete class de-alignment. One of the most significant models is called rational choice model, and the rational choice model is in some ways really compelling. In other ways, you can see some potential flaws in it. So people, it argues, would vote for the party that will act in their best interest. So it's a matter of self-interest. Which party will do best for me? It does assume, and this is, I think, probably one of the problems it gets into, that people are going to make a well-informed, cold, logical choice, and that everybody who's voting will do this, and that will mean that you end up with the government that best suits society as a whole. We'd end up with wonderfully popular governments if this was the case, I think. But actually, I'm not sure that this is the case. I mean, the idea of self-interest appears to be compelling. I mean, one of the ways the 92 result, which was a big surprise Conservative win, is often explained, is that people going into the elections explained that they were going to vote for Labour because they thought they would spend more on the NHS, and they thought they'd do more to help unemployment and things like that. And then they got in the voting booth and went, but I'll have to pay more tax. And so they voted Conservative. And that's the way that surprise result was explained, and therefore the rational choice model seems to make a lot of sense. However, the idea that all voters across the country are carrying out some kind of complex cost-benefit analysis seems unlikely. I mean, there seems to be an awful lot of other factors that might come in that maybe aren't quite so logical about how they feel about the party leaders, or past voting, or family history, or regions in which they live, ethnicity, gender, age, all these other things. It seems to completely take those out. Well, there are actually some quite compelling trends in some of those. So again, maybe we'll have some doubts. Issue voting. Well, this is again fairly compelling and straightforward. The voters pick who to vote for based on which party is closest to their position on the policy they see as being the most important. Now, it's different to the rational choice because the rest of the party's policies might not actually be in their favour. It might not actually be a rational choice. It is simply on what is the big issue of the day. Who do I think is going to do the best job? And sometimes you get circumstances with an election where there is a particularly big issue. And 2019 is a really good demonstration on this. Everything really in the campaign was all about Brexit, and you could argue the Conservatives on that issue were more in line with more people than any of the other parties, and this can explain the shift, for example, in the north of England towards the Conservatives. So people who traditionally wouldn't have voted Conservatives did, because of the issue they cared about most. The Conservatives were the closest to what they wanted, and the people that they thought were most likely to deliver what they wanted. We've also seen it at times, where, for example, when there's been great economic difficulties, and we see this in '79 with economic difficulties and the winter of discontent. And again, if that's the big issue, and people felt the Conservatives were most likely to be able to deal with it, then they voted accordingly. Now, valence issues are slightly different. These are issues where there isn't really disagreement between the parties. So you've not got one party going, I want the economy to prosper, and another party saying, I really don't. Or I want the NHS to be highly effective and help people, and another party saying, I don't. So they're all going to say, we want a really strong economy, we want a really good NHS. And what valence issue means is that the people vote for the party they think is going to best deliver. So we want a strong economy. Well, who do we trust most on the economy? Do we think the Conservatives have got the greatest governing competency, or that the Labour Party will have the greatest governing competency? So it's the perceived ability of that party to govern, and it can override other issues. So it might be that in fact, one party's manifesto looks more attractive than the others, but if you don't trust the party with the attractive manifesto to deliver it, then you don't vote for them. And again, this was argued to be one of Corbyn's big issues in recent elections, where lots of people really loved a lot of the stuff that was on his manifestos. They just didn't trust him to deliver it, and there was the issue of whether he could be trusted, for example, with the economy or with foreign policy, and that really affected the vote. And the theory is on this one, on valence issues, that if you elect them because you think they're going to be competent and they're going to do a good job in government, if they prove not to, then they will be punished at the next election. And again, this might be something we look forward we look for in 2024. Another really important factor is the party leader, and the UK media and increasingly voters focus on party leaders. So do they make a difference? Well, a lot of things seem to say yes. A strong leader will win over floating voters. So Johnson proved to be a very attractive party leader in 2019. So he won over people who possibly wouldn't have voted, or definitely wouldn't have voted Conservative previously. An inspiring leader will get their core vote out. I mean, parties in the past have lost because their core vote just hasn't turned out. It's become apathetic. He'll get the activists going. And a good leader will unify a party behind them. And being a unified party has proved to be really, really important in UK politics. Now, there are some arguments that attack this and go, well, actually, people are not voting for a leader, but for a local MP. The problem with that criticism, I would say, is I'm not sure everybody's necessarily aware of that particularly. And this isn't helped by the way that the media talk about it. So events and policies can be more important. So you can have a brilliant leader, but they could be, if the party's policies aren't there, or major events have made people think that another party would be more suitable to leading, it can have a kind of a nullifying effect. And then you've got actually probably a core of voters who will remain loyal come what may. So they will vote for the party of their preference. Doesn't matter who's the leader, doesn't matter what the issues are, they will just remain loyal. And we see this as a frustration for the minor parties in the UK, where there seems to be core votes for both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, which just don't shift. The media focus is undoubtedly almost completely on the leaders, and this has been further developed with the kind of American-style leadership debates, and the whole thing with Johnson versus Corbyn dominated in 2019. So now I'm going to look at some of these elections in a bit more detail. Well, in 1979, Labour had been in power since 74, been a minority government since 76. In 76, it had to borrow money from the IMF because of the dire economic straits England was in. In 79, we've got the winter of discontent, where we've got huge numbers of people out on strike, we've got rubbish left in the streets, and all kinds of disruption being caused to the economy. So this would suggest that Valence issues were really significant. They would suggest that people would punish the Labour Party because they hadn't proven to be capable of effectively govern and bringing economic prosperity, for example. And the Conservatives used their slogan "Labour isn't working." And you can see that very famous campaign poster above me. And that poster seems to be particularly effective. The kind of confrontational style the Conservatives adopted early in the election campaign seems to be slightly unpopular, and polls suggested that the parties didn't like the people didn't like the parties being overly confrontational. So both Callaghan and Thatcher kind of pulled back from that. Now, in terms of leadership, I mean, there were major concerns about Thatcher at this point. She seemed to lack experience in comparison to Callaghan. There were concerns about her relatability to ordinary voters and the way that she came across. Labour possibly didn't seem to be offering anything new, whilst the Conservatives were offering some fairly radical change. With tax cuts and the right to buy scheme. And again, this might be a case of issues fitting very nicely to the time period because things hadn't been working, and therefore you could see why the party that was offering change, offering something different, would be more attractive at the end of the 1970s. So at the start of the campaign, the Conservatives were miles ahead in the polls. So Labour's time in office, 74 to 79, had not been a particularly effective one. Both parties actually, this is an important election campaign in the way that the parties started to make use of the media. They'd have their press conferences at the right time to hit the lunchtime news. They'd have the leader walkabouts at the time to hit the evening news, early evening news, and then they would have the major speeches been made in time to hit the late evening news. So they were starting to work out that actually what was really important was the way it was presented through the daily news programmes on the TV channels. Both parties looked to keep their radical wings quiet. Labour manages to do this in 79, though they are ruling the roost by the time we get into the 83 election, and the Conservatives keep the more radical elements of their party under wraps as well. So the whole campaign is rather subdued, and people at the time said, well, actually, in terms of the campaign, Callaghan seemed to outperform Thatcher, and the gap narrowed, but it didn't narrow enough, and the fact it was narrowing in the opinion polls encouraged that core Conservative vote to turn out. So the results saw 339 seats for the Conservatives with 44% of the votes, and that was an increase in 62 seats. Whilst Labour only got 269 seats, 37% of the vote, and they lost 50 seats. Regionally, the Conservatives gained across all regions, but most notably became very dominant in the south. And they continued to dominate A, B, and C1s in terms of our class system, but they made gains in both C2s of about 11% gain and a 9% gain in D and E as well. And therefore, again, we're starting to get this idea of class de-alignment because the Conservatives are starting to pick up more votes in areas, areas where they wouldn't normally have done so. Again, even at this point, we've got young voters are voting Labour, 18 to 24-year-olds, but anything above that, the Conservatives won all the other age groups. And there was a slight preference amongst female voters for the Conservatives, possibly explained by the fact they had a female candidate. In 1997, we've got, again, some quite remarkable circumstances. The Conservatives have been in power for 18 years. They've been in power since that election we've just looked at in 79. They were increasingly split over Europe, and there was the emergence of the referendum party. They've been damaged by a whole series of sleaze scandals, both sex scandals and financial scandals. There were significant issues of unemployment, and again, we're talking at a peak of 11 million at a peak of 3 million unemployed. So 3 million is a gigantic number. We've seen panics about unemployment rising in recent times with the COVID crisis, but you're looking at numbers that are half what it was back in the 90s. The UK had been ejected from the European Exchange Rate Mechanism, the ERM. Famously, the Sun newspaper swapped allegiance to support the Labour Party, and the Conservatives just seemed to be in free fall. At the same time, the Labour Party were offering new ideology. They were offering new solutions to what was going on in terms of their third way, which had emerged under Blair. They made 5 kind of key pledges on crime, the NHS, on unemployment, particularly amongst the younger people, on VAT on heating, and on not raising income taxes. Again, what Labour seemed to be trying to do was to reassure the population about them on valence issues, particularly the running of the economy, an issue they struggled on in the past and had led to Conservative dominance, but one which the Conservatives had kind of forfeited, actually, really, because there had been such strong economic problems that the idea that the Conservatives can turn around and say you can trust us on the economy didn't seem to ring true. That very negative campaign, the New Labour, New Danger, very infamous poster up above me on this, seemed to backfire. Labour, in the meantime, were running a very polished, highly professional campaign, and the Conservatives seemed to struggle to move any media focus on them away from the various sex scandals and financial scandals. And there was kind of a great deal of voter apathy. It seemed fairly clear to a lot of the Conservative voters that they were going to lose, and that actually this probably discouraged a lot of Conservative voters from turning out at all. Blair polled and performed much better than Major during the campaign, and whilst Blair was seen as young and charismatic, Major was seen as weak and boring. The old spitting image puppet of him where it was completely grey and obsessed with peas and Y-fronts that really did him quite a lot of damage, and so Major was really pilloried in the media, whilst Blair was this fresh young thing. The 97 results were an absolute landslide for the Labour Party. So they won 43.2% of the vote, and this then gave them a huge number of seats, disproportionately high number of seats, 418, which was a massive gain of 147 seats. The Conservatives only picked up 30.7% of the vote, but they were even more disproportionately punished in terms of seats, winning a tiny 168. They actually lost more seats than they held. They lost 171 seats. The Liberal Democrats also had a good showing, picking up 46 seats with a gain of 26. In the regions, the Conservatives lost all their seats in Scotland and Wales, and so we can see them becoming, again, this is one of the fears of the Conservative Party going forward from this, they become essentially just an English party rather than a British one. They held only 11 seats in London. They lost their dominance in the south. They did keep, however, their kind of rural dominance. So if you look at an election map from 97, it's quite amazing, really, because although you've got this gigantic Labour victory, if you look at the map still looks really rather blue, and that's because the large rural constituencies, large in terms of size rather than number of people, the Conservatives were still winning in the countryside, and that really has remained the Conservative core vote. No matter how badly they might do elsewhere or how well they might do elsewhere, they always win those rural constituencies. The Labour Party gained across all classes, most notably the C1s and the C2s, so 19% and 15% rises respectively in that. And this was largely a targeted campaign in which the Labour had gone after the middle class vote, what they called Mondeo man. Mondeos were a Ford car at the time. And we also see the Labour Party doing particularly well with the BME vote, winning 70% of that, and actually outperformed the Conservatives in the white vote, 43% to 32%. This again might be more of a reflection of just how badly the Conservative Party had done, rather than any particular shift in terms of the white vote in a longer term trend. Age, again, we see a connection with age. Conservatives won the 65 plus vote, but Labour won all the rest. So the connection is there, but maybe not quite that strong at this point. So this is a massive victory for the Labour Party, and it then leads on to the Labour Party remaining in power all the way through to 2010, with 2001, which I wouldn't recommend you choose as one of your three, because it's probably the dullest election of them all, other than having really low voter turnout that followed, and the Blair years see real Labour dominance. Now, the 2017 election is a really interesting one. It really is the election that should never have happened due to the fact we had a fixed Parliament Act in place, which meant that really we should have had our next election after the 2015 one in 2020. May also, who was Prime Minister, adamantly said she was not going to call an election, and then she seemed to go walking in Wales and change her mind. Obviously, all of this is in the aftermath of the Brexit vote in 2016. The Conservatives were struggling with a small majority, but were ahead in the polls, and May thought she could take advantage of this. Conservative policies of austerity came into focus, with Labour offering policies to improve both welfare and scrapping university fees. There was a huge debacle over the dementia tax by the Conservative government that saw a U-turn within 24 hours of the policy being announced. There was also some major events at the time, with a couple of terrorist attacks, notably one in Manchester, another one in London, and this put actually law and order tends to play really well as a vote winner for Conservatives, but in this particular case, it put the focus on Conservative police cuts. Infamously, May refused to take part in the leadership debates and was very widely attacked for this. We also see, on the other hand, we saw Labour's Diane Abbott struggling to remember figures when talking about both economic issues and in particular with recruiting more policemen. And both parties were hamstrung by internal divisions and infighting. May's message of strong and stable kind of fell very badly flat. And Corbyn performed a lot better than was expected, but he failed to really take advantage of it. The Conservative Party, who on things like Valence Issues and the popularity of some of their policies, should have been really, really struggling. There was a big shift back to the two main parties, although neither of them particularly covered themselves in glory during this election campaign, and we got a hung parliament. So the Conservatives picked up 42.4% of the vote, and that gave them 318 seats, so they lost 13 seats overall. Labour saw a very significant rise in their vote. They picked up 40% of the vote, which gave them 262 seats, and that was a gain of 30 seats. Class voting really, at this point, seems to have been turned on its head, with the Conservatives gaining in C2 and DE, whilst Labour gained in A, B and C1. And it's at this point really that education seems to become a better indicator than class in terms of which way people were going to vote. And again, as I said earlier, higher levels of education, less likely to vote, because it's possibly linked, as people suggested, to issues around Brexit, and particularly to do with the age of people who were voting and the comparative levels of education that predominantly people were able to access who were in those different age bands. So in 2017, if we look at this graph and we look at kind of age and gender, then we can see that amongst men, the Labour Party performed better in the younger age groups, and the Conservatives better in the older age groups. It's even more marked with women voters, with a really, really strong difference between the kind of your 18 to 24s compared to your 55 pluses. And again, this then takes us back to voter turnout, where younger voters are less likely to vote, older voters are more likely to vote, and also the turnout amongst female voters is slightly lower than that of male. So the country is split in a very interesting way on this, and it does look like age is quite a good way of being able to make an assessment on how someone is likely to vote. If we move on to 2019 then, so we've had the 2017 election. May gets through. She ends up having to have a special arrangement with the DUP, and she kind of limps through for a couple of years. Corbyn, having done better than many of his critics in the Labour Party had expected him to, kind of hangs on and survives. And we have all the fighting in Parliament, everything over Brexit. May steps down and she's replaced by Boris Johnson. Johnson suffers a series of defeats in Parliament and is at loggerheads with the Remain side of his party, and he decides to go to the country. Now he has got a bit of a bump, but a bit of a boost in terms of getting party members behind him, having just won the election. And so he did revitalise the Conservative Party, essentially by just getting rid of those who disagreed with him. It had created a greater sense that there was going to be unity going forward. So he wins the election, promising an oven-ready Brexit, and on this issue the Conservatives polled much better than the Labour Party. Corbyn suffered very greatly on Valence Issues in 2019, with the media in particular, but also the public not trusting his ability to govern and to get Britain out of the mess it was in over the whole EU issue. The campaign itself was almost completely focused on Brexit and the two leaders. It's a really weird time of year for a general election as well, and it came up with some quite unexpected results. So we've got the fall of the Red Wall that demonstrated a shift in regional voting, with areas that had never been Conservative before shifting their vote. SNP dominance in Scotland was underlined, with them winning 48 of the 56 seats. We saw a significant Conservative majority, despite the fact that actually their percentage of the vote only increased by 1% from 2017. So you wouldn't have thought you'd go from being a minority government to a significant majority with only a 1% swing, or 1% gain in your vote, but the swing was much bigger. So the big story really was the fall in the Labour vote rather than the rise in the Conservative one. So the Conservatives, 43.6% of the vote, 365 seats, a gain of 48. Labour falls all the way down to 32.1%. Remember, in 2017 they were up at 40%. They won only 202 seats. They lost 60 seats. So I've got a whole kind of range of statistics on this, and one of the things that you can see again is that connection on education in the top left-hand corner, where we can see that the Conservatives do much better in the lower education bands, and then we kind of get that in swap over when we get to the high levels degree or above. The age connection is almost kind of like a perfect graph in the way that it shifts, and it just shows step by step, the older you get, the more likely you are to vote Conservative. If the last general election had been only voted on by the under 40s, then you can see that the Labour Party would have won an overwhelming majority. But if it had only been held by those who were over 40, it would have been absolutely decimated. So we can see a divide in voter preference based on age, and that connection seems to be really strong 2015, 2017, 2019. We talked earlier about class de-alignment, and you can see from the graph on the bottom left that this really does seem to be the case, because the Conservative lead over the Labour Party is almost uniformed going through. So the Labour Party is picking up 32 in AB, 34 in C1, 34 in C1, 30, and then 34 in DE. And the Conservatives is in the 40s going across. So it does look like education matters, age matters, but social class doesn't anymore. And the kind of ground in regional ism of voting behaviour seems to have potentially 2019 been broken down as well. So a really interesting election, again, one that you'll find a lot of still ongoing analysis of, and lots of really up-to-date stuff to have a look at. I hope that's been useful. This is much longer than my normal videos, as I've tried to cover a huge amount in this in terms of getting the case studies in there as well. But seeing the way that the spec demands on this, I thought that was worth doing. So I hope you've liked it. I hope you've stuck it out and got to this point in the video. If you have done, hit that like button. If you want more on A-level politics, and there's a whole range of videos, a whole range of topics, I'm aiming to cover the whole of the specification, then hit the subscribe and get notifications as I add more to that. There's also hints on how to get good grades. There's also how to videos on the different types. Again, anything you want to ask me, anything you want to know, hit the comments, or anything you've got to say about what I've presented. Right, thank you again for watching. I'll catch you all again soon.